Is that okay?
Briefly, please, because we have to finish by 5:30.
Sure, thank you. I mean, it's amazing, these three speakers. It's absolutely amazing. We learned a lot. The first one is, I mean, I was a bit surprised you said corruption perhaps is a minor issue, 5% or so. But I don't, yeah. But, you know, I don't want to blame outsiders. You know, we have to take the blame ourselves for missed policies over the years, small countries, closed up, inward looking and so on. So I think, you know, we have to change course and understand that as a small country, unless we are able to capture the larger markets, perhaps our growth is going to be restricted. The second point is on the legalization of, or legislation on the IMF conditions. We as a political party, we have gone to the Supreme Court and we precisely brought up the issue of shocks, and that we cannot be bound by these targets. We hope that the Supreme Court will listen to arguments and strike off the entire chapter in that economic transformation bill. The third one is in terms of growth. The IMF doesn't pay sufficient attention in this agreement to growth. And we have argued with the IMF that we want to renegotiate this agreement if we form the next government, and that we need to focus more on growth, and not just on growth, but on non-tradable growth, because to them growth is growth, but we think non-tradable growth is what we need to focus on. And the next point is a complicated one. Martin, you're talking about the debt restructure. It is imminent that we may sign an agreement, not with the bilateral bondholders, Paris Club, that's all right, let's say, but with the ISP holders on a macro-linked bond, which ties us to a state-specific situation. And if we do well, then they do better, in that we are going to agree to a 28% haircut, but once the one-time test is conducted in 2028 January, depending on how much our GDP is, there is 70 to 80% probability that the haircut may fall to 7.2% from 28%. And the last point is about, you talked about the debt standstill, the interest not being accumulated while the negotiations are going on. And that's brilliant, and we would want to support you in any forum that you argue for this matter. But there's one other point that I want to bring out, and that is the beneficial ownership of these bondholders. For instance, there was a big issue when the previous government wanted to pay $500 million, and we argued, look, you know, who is benefiting from that? And there's no way in which people can find out. It's completely black box, because the trustees won't let the world know who owns these bonds. So there is perhaps corruption in that bond itself. Perhaps it's a circular flow of money. The money flows out of here and then comes back and it gets paid back again. So those are my observations, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you. So we go to the question in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion, and I want to thank all of you for your comments. I wanted to ask you a little more on the implications of exiting the bond market. What would that really mean in practice? Would it mean that all the negotiations would sort of stop with the bilaterals and with the ISP holders? And what would be the implications for the country in terms of other international processes? Would you expose yourself to litigation, to seizure of assets, and so on? And what would be the other international implications? The other question is, it seemed that the World Bank and the bilateral creditors and so on were waiting for this IMF agreement before they came on board to support Sri Lanka. So what would be the implications if you were to break the rules? Would you run into other encounters with the World Bank and other bilateral donors?
This person here? Yeah. சொல்லுங்க.
மலையக மக்கள் வந்து பொருளாதாரத்தில் வந்து முதலிடமா இருக்கிறாங்க. இலங்கையில் வந்து மலையக மக்கள் தான் பொருளாதாரத்தை முன்னிலைமை காட்டிருக்கிறாங்க. இருந்தாலும் அவங்களோட வாழ்க்கை தரம் எல்லாமே உயர் மட்டத்தில் இல்லை, தாழ்மையான மட்டத்தில் தான் இருக்குது. இலங்கையில் வந்து கடன் தொகை அப்படின்னு சொல்லும் போது பல நிவாரணங்கள் கொடுக்கப்பட்டு இருந்தாலும் மலையக மக்களுக்கு வந்து அந்த நிவாரணம் எதுவுமே கிடைக்கிறது இல்லை. அந்த பணத்தை வந்து நிவாரணமாக பணமாக கொடுக்காம நம்ம நாட்டில் வந்து ஒரு விவசாயமா இல்லை சுயதொழில் அப்படியான ஒரு கடன் தொகையை கொடுத்தா இந்த நாடுக்கு வந்து ஒரு பொருளாதார சுமை நீக்கும் அப்படின்ட்டு உங்களோட கருத்து என்னன்னு உங்களுக்கு
she's from the hill country in the plantations, and her question is that with the economic crisis there's certain subsidies that are being provided, but it's not reaching the people in the estates. If the funds allocated for such subsidies could be used to create employment, that would be beneficial. And what are your thoughts on that?
வணக்கம். நான் சௌரன் சாட்சியோடைய கருத்திலிருந்து என்னுடைய கருத்துரை தொடங்கலாம். அதாவது சால்ஸ் அவர்களுடைய கருத்தை நாங்கள் வரவேற்றுக் கொள்கின்ற அதே நேரத்தில் நாங்கள் எங்களுடைய முயற்சியூடாக நாங்கள் எங்களுக்கென்ற பொருளாதாரத்தை உருவாக்கி கொள்ள வேண்டும் என்றதிலே மாற்று கருத்தில்லை. ஆனால் இந்த நாட்டிலே சிறிமாவோ பண்டாரநாயக்க அவர்களுடைய ஆட்சி காலத்திலே சார்பு பொருளாதார கட்டமைப்பு வந்து உருவாக்கப்பட்ட ஒரு நிலையிலே விவசாயம் மீன்பிடித்துறை ஒரு வளர்ச்சி போக்கை அடைந்து கொண்டு வந்தது. ஆனால் அதுக்கு பிற்பாடு வந்த ஆட்சியாளராக இருந்த ஏவர்த்தன் அவர்களுடைய திறந்த பொருளாதார கொள்கையினூடாக இந்த சுய பொருளாதாரம் உடைக்கப்பட்டு மக்கள் அந்த சுய பொருளாதார கட்டமைப்பிலிருந்து அந்நியப்படுத்தப்பட்டார்கள். அவை அண்டையிலிருந்து அதிகமான பொருளாதார வறுமை அதிகரிக்க தொடங்கியது. சினிமா காலத்துக்கு முற்பட்ட காலத்திலே வந்து பொருளாதார வறுமை இருந்திருந்தாலும் ஆனால் அவர் புரிந்த சுய பொருளாதாரம் வந்து நாட்டுக்கும் நாட்டு மக்களுக்கும் அந்த நன்மை பயக்கக்கூடியதாக இருந்தது. அதுக்கு பிற்பாடு வந்த யுத்தம் பல துறை வந்து சீரழிக்கப்படுறதுக்கு காரணமாக இருந்தது. ஆக இந்த யுத்தத்துக்கு பின்னாலே இருந்தவர்களும் அதை தங்களுக்கு சாதகமாக பயன்படுத்தி கொண்டுதான் இந்த நாட்டினுடைய பொருளாதாரத்தை சீரழித்தார்கள். அப்போ யுத்தம் முடிக்கப்பட்ட பிற்பாடு அதாவது இந்த இலங்கை நாடு ஒரு கேந்திர முக்கியத்துவமான இடத்தில் இருக்கின்றபடியால் இந்த இலங்கை நாட்டை, அதாவது சொற்பன சுந்தரியை யார் வச்சு போட்டி இருக்கின்றது அடிப்படையில் இந்த நாட்டுக்கு முக்கோண போட்டியின் அடிப்படையில் நிதி வழங்கப்படுகின்றது. ஆக இந்த நிதியை வழங்குகின்றவர்கள் தங்களுடைய அரசியல் நிகழ்ச்சி நிரலை வழிநடத்துறதை நோக்கமாக கொண்டு நிதிகளை வழங்குகின்றார்களுடைய உங்களுடைய பொருளாதாரத்தை கட்டி வளர்ப்பதற்கு அதுக்கு தடையாக இருக்கக்கூடிய காரணிகளை இனங்கண்டு அதை நீக்குவதற்கான வழியை அரசாங்கத்துக்கு ஆலோசனையாக சொல்லவும் இல்லை. அவர்களும் அதை செய்ய விடுவதற்கு அதை தீர்க்கிறதுக்கு தயாராக இல்லை. இதுதான் பின்புலமாக இருக்கின்றது. அதே நேரத்தில் ஒரு விஷயம் அதுக்கு பின்னால இருக்கக்கூடிய ஒரு விஷயம் என்றால் இந்த நாட்டிலே வேறு ஒரு மக்கள் சார்பு அரசியல் பொருளாதாரம் வரக்கூடாது என்றதிலே அவர்கள் கவனமாக இருக்கிறார்கள்.
It's not a question, it's a comment that in Sri Lanka during the 1970s under the leadership of Srimawa Bandaranaike, there was emphasis on agriculture, fisheries and the rural economy. The policies that followed led to undermining agriculture and fisheries, as well as due to the war there was further destruction. Now after the war, and as Sri Lanka gained geopolitical importance, the geopolitical conflicts over Sri Lanka have led to major powers investing in Sri Lanka for their own interests, and then also the self-interest of our elite has also not led to development. Any other questions? We probably have to wrap up now. Okay. No, over there. No, I'm sorry, I can't take a second question. Let's give others a chance, please. In the back there. No, here.
Professor touched on the fact that we could go to. Professor Guzman touched on the fact that we could go to negotiations for the debt reduction, but we need to have power. And at the same time, Professor Bush touched on the fact that if the debtors come into one position, and we could have an impact on the IMF agreements and also debt reduction part. But if this path fails, is there any other alternatives that we could go for as considering the status of Sri Lanka in the world?
One last question from there.
I just want to say that we have this economic commission. So we have austerity at one level, and then we have this economic program of liberalization of the entire country. So the emphasis on foreign investment. So that seems to be the government's and even maybe opposition, I don't know, response to the crisis is to open up the doors for investment where land is going to be alienated. So the entire country is going to be kind of on sale. And also services like education and health. Health is also now being touted as a health tourism, rather than as health care for the people. So I also wonder, and while we are talking of us and the IMF, there is also a class of people in this country that's part of the IMF, part of that class of negotiation. And this is not a question, this is a comment, but are there other countries that have experienced this?
Okay, thank you. Now, I think we have to bring the panel to a close because our friends here have another meeting that they have to go to. So we'll take a last round of responses, and I'm also going to give Ermiza a chance. She's an attorney at law. If you want to say anything briefly, because there were a couple of questions about the law at this time, which is a bit specific to Sri Lanka, and then we'll come in this order: Charles, Jayati, and Martin.
Thanks, Ahilan. I did hear a few questions and concerns in relation to the law. I, in fact, came to this event straight from the Supreme Court after concluding hearings on the Economic Transformation Bill. There were those arguments made that there are these targets that are now being included into the law and fixed in the law. And it not only is a question of shocks, and which is the serious concern where we are not even allowing for that flexibility for the executive in the future, but holding the executive and even a future legislature, a future parliament, to certain targets without that flexibility of the people deciding based on what's happening and our aspirations, right? So I think even in discussing in all of these laws that are coming in, and there is a whole host of laws, there really is a need not only to challenge before the Supreme Court, but also to understand and share that understanding and discuss, have public discourse on what these laws mean. For the Economic Transformation Bill, and I know it's before court, but I will only say that these are the basis on which it was challenged. It is a law that is creating economic zones, investment zones, under an economic commission, anywhere in Sri Lanka. There's an economic commission, there's a Sri Lanka zones, identifies any land, any area, creates an investment zone anywhere in Sri Lanka. Investors can be domestic or foreign, even 100% foreign owned. There can be exclusions and modifications of the laws of our country for those zones. So this is one law. And the impact of that, not just for us today, but for the future generations of Sri Lankans are significant, was the argument that was made. And if we don't have a public discourse, the Supreme Court determining is one thing, but it's limited. we also have to have the people understand what this means for our futures. And so I'm looking at laws in that holistic way and the cumulative effect also. We've seen pension fund related laws coming in, we've seen Aswasuma coming in. It's not the individual laws that we are challenging and looking at faults in. But we're looking at the cumulative effect of these laws on the lives of people, particularly the poor, particularly the working people. And in that context also from the question on the plantations, where there are very specific vulnerabilities, harsh vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, particularly at this time.
So I just wanted to respond to two things. There was a point made, I think it was a comment. I think it referred to the lack of attention to agriculture, and that there's no lending to the sector, and so rural employment suffers by it. I wanted to say that that's not very accidental. I think in the short to medium term, the purpose of the restructuring program is to both attract foreign exchange and foreign capital, one form or the other, and to export more, so that is foreign exchange to boost the reserves and to be able to service the debt. But our argument is always that, you see, agricultural productivity, even if it is non-tradable, in the sense that your point about non-tradable, that you are not exporting, but you are saving on imports, first and foremost. And secondly, you are investing in nutrition and rural employment. And nutrition is, in the medium to long term, is an investment. It's an investment good. It contributes to productivity growth in the future. That's why one has to resist the anti-agrarian bias of these restructuring programs. On the question of attracting foreign investment, yes, part of the restructuring program, the objectives is that you create incentives that would attract private capital. And I think that's good, but we had an interesting experience with Zambia, and that's something to keep in mind. So the Zambians actually lose more money in profit repatriation only. That doesn't include other illicit ways of capital outflow, just profit repatriation. Transfers from primary incomes, than they actually spend on their current debt servicing. Foreign direct investment can be a major funnel for capital outflows. And that means the regulations, the government regulation that goes with the incentives for foreign direct investment must also ensure that we cover the loopholes for capital flight.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just take up this issue about the sort of legal implications of breaking the rules. And I want to highlight one additional concern that we haven't actually mentioned, and that has to do with the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms that exist when you sign international agreements, whether it is a trade agreement, but specifically in this case, bilateral investment treaties. And I was told yesterday that Sri Lanka is a signatory to 30 of them. So what typically happens is that because the ISDS operates under rules that have a very expansive notion of investment. So bond holding is also investment, intellectual property is also investment, all kinds of things are investment. And they can claim that anything that reduces this is expropriation. And we also know that the ISDS tribunals are very, shall we say, investor friendly. They tend to agree with investors and pretty much punish the governments concerned. So if you are doing these things, you would have to actually think seriously about whether you want to remain in particular ISDS, particular BITs, bilateral investment treaties, and particular tribunals like the ICSID tribunal run by the World Bank. Why? Because these are known to be very one-sided, and because there's a lot of countries that I think there were 9 in Africa and 7 in Latin America, I may be wrong, that actually withdrew from ICSID. Yeah. And that, you really have to think, you have to, if you like, you have to guard your flanks before you do these measures. You have to actually be aware of that potential problem before you get into this. The other problem with ISDS is that it can come in and kick you if you go through with this constitutional law. If you go in with for this new law, and if these special economic zones are created and allocated, then if you want to change it later, if you want to repeal it and bring back sovereignty and autonomy, those companies can actually sue you under a bilateral investment treaty. And we have the really shocking case of Honduras, which has been asked to pay 87% of its annual revenues as a compensation because they did precisely that in a special economic zone called St. John's Bay, which they wanted to bring under their own laws again. So bear in mind that these measures you have to really, if you like, cover your backs and guard your flanks before you go in for these.
Thank you. It's just a quick reaction to this issue of the macro-linked bond. The idea that is it tied to economic growth? So if the economy grows more, it pays more. So in general, that could be well designed. It could be a good idea because when an economy grows more, it has more capacity to repay. When it falls, it has lower capacity to repay. What's important is to design it in a way that doesn't refer only to the good part of the economic cycle, to the upside, right? So because otherwise you miss part of the benefits of economic growth, but you don't gain anything when things go badly. So if you're going to design a macro-linked bond, it makes sense if it gives you insurance in situations in which the economy grows less or falls, and therefore there is no payment capacity, and your payments, according to the contracts, are lower as well. This is key. What I'm seeing in the international cases is what's called value recovery instruments, which is basically a way of saying how can we extract more money from the country, not how can we design more sustainable bonds. So be careful. Be careful. The second question was about exiting. I don't quite understand the idea of exiting if it refers to Sri Lanka. Exiting is not a decision of the debtor, it's a decision of the creditor, of the creditor community. Sri Lanka has been cut off the market already, so it's not, it doesn't have access to the international credit market. So the point is, how can it restore the sustainability of the debt? And it's clear, based on any thoughtful economic analysis, that there needs to be a debt restructuring. So the debt restructuring should be deep enough to restore the sustainability of the debt. No less deep than that, because otherwise the country won't resolve its crisis. And if the country wants to do it deeper than what's necessary, it's going to create a bad relationship with the international credit markets for the future. And we have to assess what's the value of that relationship. Again, in the short term, it's going to be probably very low because of the low liquidity levels in the global economy. But in a more mature stage of economic development, the access, and in more normal conditions for the international economy, the value of access might be higher. But all countries should try to develop their own capital markets, borrow in their own currency under their own legislation. For that, countries need savings. Okay, and that's where the money comes from the savings. But the part that I didn't think was that. Let me put it in other terms. So you spoke about other creditors waiting for the agreement with the IMF to provide financing. This is a common issue in the IMF negotiations. Promises of the IMF calls it the catalytic effect. Sign on a program with the IMF and you will get money from others, the IMF says. And sometimes governments replicate that notion. Pardon my French, that's bullshit. Who is going to provide money now based on the program with the IMF? The private bondholders? No, that's not going to happen. Not going to happen anytime soon. China is not going to care about the program with the IMF. China is too big. China is as big as the IMF today in the developing country world. And China might even develop in the near future its rules like the IMF does, deciding under what terms can lend to countries if the country is in arrears, in default with the IMF. So is it going to come from where else? The World Bank. The World Bank has very low finance. So these institutions are struggling to provide financing now. And maybe some money may come in. But what's the cost of that? So if a country decides to go into an agreement with the IMF just based on the hope that some money could come into the country for financing projects at such an enormous cost, I mean, that's a bet that seems it's a bit crazy. Why would you sign on an agreement when the costs are so certain based on the expectation, probably and almost for sure unfounded, that there will be money coming in from other sources in a global landscape in which the problem is lack of money, is lack of liquidity for everyone? It's not going to happen. We went through the same in Argentina. In 2018, the government was saying, no, we have to sign this deal with the IMF, there's going to be a catalytic effect. You know how much money the country got? Zero. Literally zero. And the money from the IMF was used to bail out unsustainable debts and finance a capital flight. So it's important to be thoughtful about in these discussions that have enormous consequences for the future of millions of people. And finally, there was this question on the alternative. I'm going to conclude with that. So what countries need is to develop dynamic comparative advantage. What are you going to produce that can be demanded for by the rest of the world and allows you to create jobs, have foreign exchange that is also necessary for the development of the non-tradable sector. Without foreign exchange, there is no development of the tradable sector. So tradable and non-tradable have to go hand by hand, and create productivity. And then, when you think about that alternative, you have to think, how do I use my fiscal resources? You as taxpayers pay. You want that your money to be well used. Of course, you want security, justice. You want roads. You also want a society that creates knowledge, right? So that's the first question. How a country can develop a dynamic comparative advantage, can be better in terms of the productivity that it creates. And what can the state do to support a more vibrant private sector? What's the best use of the resources of the state? And that fiscal policy, how is it supported by the monetary policy, by a financing policy? Are your taxes enough to meet the expenses that you think are the appropriate one at this moment, or you want to borrow more? If you borrow, from who? In what currency? Under what legislation? In what terms? Those are the questions when you come up with an alternative. Yeah, it's very common to hear in IMF negotiations, oh, there is no alternative. Again, there is always an alternative. And ultimately, what the government needs to do is to explain why that financing is so critical for the plan that it developed. And if it has no answers, well, we have to look for other answers. What will be the set of policies that will be more conducive to the development of a society? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Skanda Kumar to close today's session. But just before that, just one point. I mean, I think we are very happy for the audience. So many people have come to listen to our three experts, and also the kind of really important interventions by our three economic experts. I think the lesson I took from it, at least from the three economic experts, is that it is all political, right? It's about, if it's about austerity, if it's about the economy growing, who is gaining? During austerity, who is losing? We are trying to reform the international system, which is very political, and even the IMF's debt sustainability analysis is a political document. We are in a very political year this year with elections. So all of you sitting here patiently and listening, let's give our three experts a round of hands for this really inspiring and engaging talks. Now I'd like to hand it over to Skanda Kumar to finish the proceedings on behalf of Yukti. Thank you.
Yes, on behalf of Yukti and Ideas, thanks once again to Dr. Charles Abugre, Professor Jyoti Ghosh, Professor Martin Guzman, to Ms. Hermes Atigal, to Dr. Aylan Kadirgamar, who moderated this discussion, and especially to all of you who are here. Some of you have traveled from far. Please keep in touch with us, with Yukti, by following us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, or X, on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel, we have a WhatsApp group. Please make sure your email address or telephone number has been registered out front. This, as I said, is only one of a series of activities, and it's very important for us to continue having dialogues, particularly outside of Colombo, in all districts of our country, among a diversity of people, both political actors and representatives, as well as civil society activists and representatives, the media and academia, and we look forward to having more interactions with international experts to keep sharing and keep discussing in solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka.